The war in Vietnam will be the topic of our lesson for this week. Now, the war in Vietnam shaped American history in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. And because of that length of time, your textbook addresses the war in Vietnam over the course of several different chapters. What I want to do is present a more unified look at the war in Vietnam and how the United States got involved in this war. Okay? So, to understand this, you need some background. Now, Vietnam in Southeast Asia has a long history as a culture, as a people with their own language, with their own traditions. And at various times in the past, they have been an independent nation. So that means that for many people in Vietnam in the 20th century, the period we're going to be focusing on, there was a strong sense of nationalism. Nationalism, the belief that your people are different and should have an independent nation that reflects their culture. Okay, now the problem in the 20th century was that Vietnam had been conquered and colonized by others. Now, traditionally in the past, it was the Chinese who had colonized in Vietnam. But beginning in the 19th century, with that wave of industrialization and colonization that I talked about earlier, it was the French who took over what will become Vietnam. So there were many people by the early 20th century who didn't like the fact that Vietnam was colonized. They wanted their own independent nation. Now, a good example of a Vietnamese nationalist was a young man by the name of Ho Chi Minh. And beginning in the early 20th century, in the early 1900s, Ho Chi Minh began a long campaign to try to secure independence for Vietnam. Now, at first, he approached the democracies. He tried to talk to the French government. He tried to talk to the United States as, kind of the leader of the democratic nations. And he appealed to those nations to grant Vietnam its freedom. He saw an opportunity at the end of World War I. Remember, at the end of World War I, the victorious nations held the Versailles Conference, where for months the victor nations, Britain, France, and the United States, primarily held a series of conferences, and they basically redrew the map of the world and divided up who would control what. Well, Ho Chi Minh went to the Versailles Conference. He rented a tuxedo and he tried to attend meetings and meet important leaders to make a pitch for the independence of Vietnam. Well, as you might guess, in 1919, Ho Chi Minh didn't get very far. Right? This is a Vietnamese man showing up in European capitals and trying to talk to important diplomats. How do you think he was treated? Well, basically, they blew him off. They wouldn't take a call for Vietnamese independence seriously. Which does raise a question we've touched on in this class. Why wouldn't they want an independent Vietnam? Well, the answer was that, nations like France benefited economically from controlling Vietnam and harvesting its resources, but also think of the logic that underlay colonialism, that colonized people weren't ready for independence. Either they were racially incapable of it, or they needed to be educated or, quote, civilized before they could be independent. So those were the answers that Ho Chi Minh got from the democracies. Well, soon after that, Ho Chi Minh became a communist. The communists like to say that colonialism was a product of capitalism, that communists didn't control other people and exploit them. All right, well, that was the official line. But in the 1920s and 1930s, many people believed that communism was a better way to achieve the independence of your nation. Okay? So now the Vietnam War will be about communism, but it will also be about nationalism and anti-colonialism. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, Ho Chi Minh began efforts to arm and organize a revolutionary movement against the French in Vietnam. That's how communists do things, right? They organize revolutions, they overthrow governments. Now, before Ho Chi Minh got a chance to launch that revolution, World War II broke out and the Japanese took over this area that will come to be known as Vietnam. And Ho and his movement fought the Japanese. And I think part of the reason they did that is because they believed that at the end of the war, when the Allied powers, including the French, won, that maybe they would be rewarded with an independent Vietnam. Okay? Well, that didn't happen. At the end of World War II, France was determined to hang on to their colonies. France had had a tough time in World War II, right? They had been conquered by the Germans. And at the end of the war, France was in a sad shape. They wanted the resources, the economic resources of Vietnam, and they wanted to hang on to their colonies kind of out of a sense of national pride as well. They had been defeated and pushed around, and they wanted to show that they were still one of the great players and they had colonies. So, in the late 1940s, in the years soon after World War II, the Vietnamese, who followed Ho Chi Minh, began a war for independence against France. Okay, this is in the late 1940s. Vietnamese rebels began a war for independence against France. And what was America's position on this? Well, the United States supported France very vigorously. The United States basically bankrolled the war in Vietnam that the French were fighting. Right? France was almost bankrupt. The United States was wealthy. We provided the money and weapons that allowed France to fight this war. Okay, this was our first major involvement in Vietnam. You can find earlier examples of minor involvement, but this is the first time the United States government makes a major commitment in money and weapons to a war in Vietnam. Which raises the question then, why was the United States government so ready to jump in and help France suppress rebels in Vietnam? Well, here's where you have to keep in mind the Cold War context of post-World War II world affairs. For the United States, all that mattered about Ho Chi Minh's movement was that it was communist. And in the early years of the Cold War, what was American policy? You must contain communism at all costs. So, the United States invested in the war in Vietnam as part of its efforts to suppress communism all over the world. Also, this is the Cold War. We wanted France on our side in the Cold War. Remember, we want to build an anti-communist coalition, so we want as many nations as possible on our side. This was a way to convince France that we were their dear friend and they should side with us. Well, this first war in Vietnam was years long. There were brutal battles between the French and the Vietnamese. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. However, eventually the Vietnamese won a major battle at a place called Dien Bien Phu, and the French agreed to a negotiation that would provide a settlement for the war. Okay, so note, neither side is fully going to get what they want out of this. It's kind of a compromise agreement. Both sides have been bloodied, they'd suffered terrible casualties. So in 1954, the French and the Vietnamese rebels met at Geneva in Switzerland and negotiated a compromise agreement to end the war. So these will become known as the Geneva Accords, and they were a compromise settlement. Neither side really got what it wanted out of this. So here's how the Geneva Accords worked. Basically, they took Vietnam and split it in half, and the communists were given control of the northern half, and a pro-French, pro-American government was given control of the southern half of the country. Now, the idea was that this separation would be temporary, that in a few years there would be elections, and whichever side had secured the most popular support would then gain control of the whole country. Okay, so it's kind of clever, right? You divide the country, give each side a chance to show what they can do, and then you hold an election and reunify the country under the winners of the election. Okay, well, Ho Chi Minh and the communists were very popular in the North. Remember, Ho Chi Minh had, for decades, organized an independence movement for Vietnam. He was a popular hero among many people. Also, the communists promised that they would break up the huge French plantations that had dominated the economy and parcel out the land to peasant villages. And that, of course, went over very well with many poor people in Vietnam. So Ho's movement, his communist movement, was quite popular. Now, having said that, that does not mean he was a nice guy. Ho was a hardcore communist revolutionary who had no problem ordering mass executions of people who opposed him. Okay, so don't interpret this as Ho was a great guy. I'm just saying that his government and his policies did win quite a bit of popular support, right? He promised independence, kicking out the foreigners, redistribution of land. All right. Now, in South Vietnam, The government was basically handed to a guy by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem. Okay, because he was friendly with the French and the United States governments. He'd been educated in France and the United States. He had become a Christian. He was anti-communist. So he had a lot of things that made him appealing to the United States government and the French government. However, none of those things made him very popular with the Vietnamese. Here was a guy who was Christian in a nation that was something like 95% Buddhist, and he was educated overseas. Many people in Vietnam saw Diem as kind of a puppet or a tool of foreign powers like France and the United States. So he was not very popular. Okay. Now, put on top of that, that the Diem government was also a repressive, violent government that had no problem jailing or killing people who opposed it. So neither government here has much of a claim on human rights. Well, several years after the Geneva Accords, it got to be time to hold the election to reunify the country. Well, the Diem government decided they didn't want an election, and the United States and South Vietnamese governments basically came to the conclusion that Ho had a very good chance of winning the election, so they canceled the election. Well, that was in 1956. And once the election was canceled, the communists felt like they had been dealt a raw deal, and they began a revolution against the South Vietnamese government. Okay, so this is initially essentially a civil war, right? You've got pro-communist Vietnamese fighting anti-communist Vietnamese almost entirely within South Vietnam. Okay, so this begins in 1956, a civil war amongst the Vietnamese over who's going to control the whole country. Okay, now this war begins in 1956, but it's going to continue into the 1960s and 1970s. Now, at first, this war was almost entirely a guerrilla war. Guerrilla warfare is where you have a non-professional force, essentially loosely organized armed civilians fighting against a professional military and against a government. That's guerrilla warfare. Now, the group that organized this effort for the communists was called the Viet Cong. That was the name of this organization that organized and armed guerrilla fighters against the Vietnamese government and later against the United States Army. All right. Now, this group was supported by North Vietnam and the communist government there. But I think it is important to remember that many people in South Vietnam supported the Viet Cong as well. Okay, American military intelligence reports oftentimes reported that something like 50% of people in the South favored the communists. And that's the issue here, is that you've got Vietnamese people fighting for and against each other. All right, so guerrilla warfare, armed civilians fighting against a professional military, that was a big part of the Vietnam War, but it's not the whole story. This was also a conventional war. And by conventional war, I mean a war fought between professional armies that wear uniforms and have modern weapons. And in 1964, the Vietnam War became a conventional war. The North Vietnamese army invaded South Vietnam. Okay? So do you see what a messy, multi-sided struggle this is? You've got professional armies fighting, you've got guerrillas fighting. It is a mess. And this is the conflict that the United States is going to get involved in. Now, the United States did not get involved in the Vietnam War overnight. This occurred as the result of a process of gradual escalation. Escalation means a gradually increasing level of tension and involvement. And because this was a process of escalation, because it was done in small increments over the course of years, it largely went unnoticed by most Americans. This was something most Americans in the late 50s and early 60s were not really paying attention to. And I think that's important to remind students of because, we're used to thinking of the Vietnam War as this tremendous issue in domestic American politics and people arguing about and protesting against the Vietnam War. Well, that will come later. late 50s, early 60s, most Americans paid no attention to what was going on in Vietnam. Because in the late 1950s, this was largely a war being fought by Vietnamese people against Vietnamese people. Now, the United States policy, of course, was to provide aid to the anti-communist South Vietnamese government. So we sent money to help that government. We provided the weapons for them to fight communism. And no, most people didn't pay any attention to that because we were doing that in nations all over the world, providing money and weapons to fight communism. So that US aid continued in the late 1950s and into the early 1960s. However, the South Vietnamese government did a pretty poor job of suppressing communist rebels. So in the early 1960s, the Kennedy administration decided that we needed to kind of step up our actions. So the United States military began to send advisors to South Vietnam. These were military officers who were sent to South Vietnam to teach the South Vietnamese military how to fight better, how to train the troops, how to use more advanced weapons. By 1963, at the time of Kennedy's death, there were 16,000 American advisors in Vietnam. So again, we've stepped it up. We're not just providing money and weapons, now we're providing advisors. Well, soon tensions will increase and American involvement will increase even more. Those military officers will sometimes be frustrated with Vietnamese military officers who don't follow their training. So more and more American officers will begin to go out into the field leading South Vietnamese troops. Now, no, the ground troops, the guys carrying the rifles and doing almost all the fighting, are still Vietnamese, but now there's American officers beginning to give orders and call the shots. It's another step up in involvement. Now, those military officers have been trained in the latest American military methods, which oftentimes called for a heavy application of firepower. So American officers leading South Vietnamese forces begin to call for airstrikes. And generally those airstrikes are provided by American aircraft. So now you still don't have Americans carrying rifles on the ground, but now you have American aircraft flying overhead bombing communist forces. Or if they're near the coast, American advisors will begin to call for the United States Navy to come and bombard the communists from the sea. So more and more Americans are getting closer and closer to the action. Okay? Now, in 1964, an incident will occur that will ramp up the tensions one step further. In the Tonkin Gulf, this body of water just off the coast of Vietnam, in the summer of 1964, some American ships will get into a conflict with some Vietnamese gunboats. And it's not much of an incident. Nobody was hurt. And, at one point, an American ship apparently got hit by a couple of bullets, but that was about it. But in the summer of 1964, Lyndon Johnson, the American president, will use the Tonkin Gulf incident, as it goes down in history, the Tonkin Gulf incident, to ask Congress to grant him presidential authority to use force in Vietnam. Okay, so LBJ, as I'm going to refer to him from here on out, LBJ used the Tonkin Gulf incident to get Congress to vote him additional authority to use military force. Now, this is part of a 20th century trend of Congress kind of passing off authority to the president. And it's hard to say exactly why they did this in 1964, probably because they didn't want to get involved in something that had the potential to be disastrous. So this was kind of passing off the buck to LBJ, and it becomes his responsibility. And LBJ sought that responsibility. Apparently, what he believed he could do is use some military force, quickly crush the communists, and then get back to what he really wanted to do, which was to reform American society. LBJ wanted to go down in history as a great civil rights reformer and as the guy who ended poverty in America. He was going to fix American society, and Vietnam got in the way of that. So he wanted to use military force, crush the rebels in Vietnam, and then get on with things in the United States. Well, of course, it didn't work out that way. But in late 1964, Lyndon Johnson gave orders for the United States Air Force to directly attack North Vietnam. No more of this just bombing rebels in South Vietnam. That went on. But now he begins to launch major air attacks directly against North Vietnam, including North Vietnamese cities, not just military bases, but transportation hubs, fuel storage facilities, and some of these things are in Vietnamese cities. Well, do you see the escalation? There's still no Americans on the ground carrying rifles, but now we're flying over Vietnam, bombing them. Well, in response to those air attacks, communist rebels in Vietnam began to attack American air bases. They didn't have a lot of weapons yet to go after the bombers. That'll happen later. So they went after the American air bases. And that's where significant numbers of Americans begin to get killed. The Vietnamese rebels attack American air bases, and in the spring of 1965, Lyndon Johnson committed American ground troops to defend American air bases. Okay, so spring of 1965 is when you begin to have large numbers of American soldiers fighting on the ground in Vietnam. And note, this all began in 1956 with American aid to the South Vietnamese government. So it took 8 or 9 years of gradual escalation for the United States to actually commit ground troops. And once you do that, the logic of war oftentimes leads to increasing involvement. Because after all, it's kind of a cliche, but what's the best kind of defense? Do you want to sit and wait for the enemy to attack you? No, you want to go on the offensive. And in 1965, American troops quickly began to go on the offensive against communists in South Vietnam. And that's where you now have American infantrymen marching into the jungles and rural areas and into the cities of South Vietnam, going after the communists. And once you begin those kind of operations, do you ever really have enough troops? The generals on the ground quickly began to call for more and more forces. And from 1965 to 1968, the United States began to commit more and more troops. Eventually, there will be 550,000 American troops on the ground in Vietnam. And just as comparison to more recent wars, let's see, about 10 years ago, the United States government launched a surge in Iraq and greatly ramped up forces to try and make major progress in Iraq. And that resulted in 180,000 troops being committed to Iraq. So keep in mind, just as comparison, the Vietnam War at its peak saw over 3 times the commitment of soldiers as we committed to Iraq. Okay. It also meant that the United States was increasing its bombing and directly bombing Vietnamese cities. Okay, so this has been a lesson focused on how the United States got involved. Next, we're going to take a look at why the United States stayed involved so long and why this war turned out the way it did.